Hi,
Hello.
how you doing?
Sorry?
How are you doing?
Oh, okay. Yes. Got a pile of exam papers to mark, but apart from that,
Oh God.
I've only got 18. It's not like
Oh
I
yeah.
don't have 300 or anything. It's
I'm just so grateful. I was in touch with a colleague at UCL last night about something else, and he said he just finished second marking. Fortunately, second marking
yeah, second
400
marking. Oh, gosh.
decision and risk scripts, and I thought, oh, this is why I retired.
Yeah, no, I taught on the first year course last year, so I had 300 to do.
It's just too many. I mean, it used to be bad enough in the days. We thought a big class was, well, not a service course, but, one for our own department might be around 100, I suppose. And that was bad enough. Just silly numbers now.
They are, and they keep getting bigger. Every year they say they're not going to take more than they do.
Well, UCL certainly does. It's taken so many because we have quite a lot of demand from good applicants.
Yeah.
And the faculty just keeps piling them in.
Yeah, we have the same thing. And they say, oh, that was a mistake. We didn't mean to take that many.
Yeah, I've heard that before too.
Yeah, and they do it every year.
Yeah.
It's any consolation, it happens here in the US as well.
Okay.
It's not like there's anywhere better.
I don't think there is, to be honest.
It completely changes how you teach. My largest was 350 students, and it's more like a performance than an educational experience.
Yeah, we can't. If we go over 300, we don't have any rooms to put them in, so we have to double teach them, which is even worse.
We have some entry-level classes that have 1,500 and are taught in 3 sections of 500, but luckily I've never touched those.
Liverpool's starting to hit 500 now for some class sizes for maths. I think there's one lecture theatre on the campus that can fit them all in. But I think they generally split it up because that's mostly used by medical students.
Yeah, well,
they get priorities.
Those big lecture theatres are in great demand by other people who have stupid numbers.
Yeah, I think it's fine. It's financial maths. I think it just seems crazy popular.
Oh, luckily we don't have an undergraduate. We only have a master's in financial maths.
Oh, it's mostly Liverpool have a partner university in China, so they take 350 maths undergraduates every year from that partner university, and all of them are doing financial maths. So that you just end up with these huge class sizes.
So do we have Ben?
Oh yeah.
I need to look on a different view that will enable me to see.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Daniel. Welcome back, Dennis. Did you have a good hot little break?
Yeah, yes, I should say yes. There's a mixture, but yes.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
I'm not sure what we should do without Ben. Has anybody got any ideas of anything we could start on?
I wouldn't mind some clarification about exactly what this meeting scope is, because so there's been a lot of confusion about some of this. I don't know how much you've seen of that discussion. I think Mark Bergman, he and I talked on the side, but so is this meeting just about the one paper, or is it about all the papers? Or
No, it's just this one paper, and we've been having these meetings regularly most weeks at this time.
So that's really interesting, because no point were
Ages.
any of us told about that. Will wasn't told, Mark Bergman wasn't told, I wasn't told that this meeting.
Are you all on the Slack channel? Because when we started off, we had a lot of people on the Slack channel, and the times for the meetings. Well, I mean, I haven't looked, but
no, I mean, I have
once we
linked
got
to that, but
started,
got no messages. I don't check Slack because I don't particularly use it except for one COVID project that I'm working on, but that's the only thing I use it for. But there were no emails about it. I did check.
The thing is, but did you ever get the bulletin, Katrina?
Bulletin of what?
The idea of the program. I mean,
Well,
the program had a weekly bulletin which ran from, I don't know, the middle of last year till the end of February, with regular meetings.
Yeah, but a lot of those
everyone on the IDP list, and you should have. I'm pretty sure you're on the circulation for that. Were you not?
The ones you had in the morning, I tried to come to one that was later in the day, but the ones you have I'm 5 hours behind you.
No, I realise that, but I think one of the reasons estimation was chosen for late in the day probably was.
But I never saw anything at a 5 o'clock time. I've never been invited to and I may have missed something, but I was certainly. I'm just trying to work out what happened, because it's not just me.
Obviously you've somehow fallen off a list at some point.
Right, but it's not just me either.
But what happened was that for several months we had a regular program where some, but not all the papers had regular slots. This one, estimation, had a slot that varied just slightly, but by half an hour or so, but ended up as this time at 5 o'clock. And pretty much regular meetings every week. And at some point, the thing is that the IDP said they wanted to stop doing the bulletin. So we have in the Dropbox, there is still the last bulletin, and the links it has are still actually valid. And at that point, the groups went over to just emailing people who they thought were involved, and obviously at that point they left you out, which was, given your earlier contribution, was probably a mistake. But we apologize.
I think
for that.
It was a mistake.
But then equally, I think that must reflect that you'd not been to any of these weekly meetings.
Right, I'd been to one, and it was really early in the morning, and it was unsustainable. I have a family. I cannot be getting up and going on to meetings when I'm taking my children to school or at 4 a.m. It's not tenable. That's all I'm just saying. It's
but the meetings about the paper. But the meetings about the paper, when I don't think were ever at that time.
I never had any agenda that said there was a 5 o'clock meeting. I'm just saying I'm not the only one. Will Probert did not have it. Mark Bergman did not. I don't know all the other people. Marissa Basket was a serious contributor at the start and has vanished also. And clearly this Victoria person that I don't know was also very upset about what happened. So there's a lot of us that have been misplaced. I personally only mediated my stuff via Will and Philip. So at some stage that didn't get through, and I'm sorry, and Philip's walking off, so it's very hard to talk, but I'm just telling you that there's a mistake that's happened, and it's not just me. There are other people who made contributions because of that SEJ workshop that you probably want to make sure you've touched base with. I'm sorry, I'm just telling you what's a factual thing. I wrote text.
I know, Karen, I'm just trying to understand why we lost you. And I think it was, this paper's unusual compared with the other ones in that it had a number of rather separate streams, of which SEJ was one. And we thought that all the various streams had been caught into people being involved in the regular meetings. And obviously, obviously in your case it wasn't. I mean, Phil's been coming to the meetings regularly, so there have been people who know told you, but obviously
But as I said, everything I had done was originally mediated through Philip or through Will.
Yeah, I mean, I
And then I never heard
did make,
anything else.
I did make an effort to contact everybody I thought could possibly be involved or interested. I was aware that a lot of those people hadn't been attending meetings, but I wasn't, of course, aware that they hadn't known about the meetings.
Righto.
I thought it was probably a question of time zones and things like that.
Well, it certainly was in part, but if there had been a 5 o'clock noon, I can do. I'm at noon. I can do noon.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do think there was a hiccup that was worth tracking down where that happened, but it's not just me. It's not just Will. There are a large number of other people, Philip, that you took text from and synthesized text from, and we need to find them, I think, in the spirit of ethical correctness.
Yes. I think, I mean, I do believe, I may be wrong, I do believe that I have been in email contact with every one of those people, but just I have been with you. I mean, when we had a reasonable draft of the section on SEJ, I thought, right, now there are a number of people who've contributed to this who, for one reason or another, haven't been involved in the discussions, and now's the time to make sure that they know about it and bring them in, which I tried to do.
So we have acknowledged the additional 3 people. Katrina, you are acknowledged as an author on the paper now, so I hope you're happy with that. Victoria and Mark as well have been added as co-authors because they responded.
Will Probert wrote text too.
I appreciate that, but I'm sure Will responded to me directly saying he has no specific desire to be named as an author. He's quite happy in to be named in the acknowledgement. So if people aren't willing, you know, I understand that we need to acknowledge people, but if they're saying that they're not interested in being named as co-authors, that, you know, we can't really force them to be named on the paper. I do accept, you know, as I've said in the emails, I accept that there was a mistake that was made, and we're sorry that, you know, we've offended people through that, but we are trying to rectify that as much as we can now. So in terms of what's happened, we've now had comments back from Hans. Hopefully you've all had time to look through those. He was generally voting positive about what we've already included. His main comments were just some references to, first of all, the challenge papers from 2015. And particularly that we haven't really referred to those particularly strongly, which I think is a very fair comment. And I think several of the papers have had similar comments from him. So I've added the HH comments document to the Dropbox, which is a carbon copy of his email to me in response to the manuscript as it was then. I've been through that today just to try and highlight what I think are the main points and which sections they correspond to.
Can I ask then?
Yeah, yes.
When I read Hans Hesterbeek's comments, he also said to be careful not to say things that had been said in the earlier papers or reiterate them extensively. The problem is I hadn't read the originals. Have you got a good familiarity with that to make sure we don't repeat?
Yeah, so I think his main concern is that if we repeat things that aren't remaining challenges, the things that have been solved since the last set of papers, I think the idea is that if they're still challenges, then absolutely we should explain them, but maybe try and explain now why they haven't been dealt with since the last set of papers rather than carbon copies. So I have added an extra document, which is a list of each of the 25 challenges that those papers highlighted. And that's called 2015 challenges.doc. I had a quick look through them, and there's clearly some which are remaining that haven't been dealt with or have continued to be mentioned in this manuscript. One of the points that Hans particularly mentions is reference to phylogenetic data that he feels we haven't mentioned exclusively. There are a couple of references to it in the paper, but maybe not as much as we could do. But having said that, there is a significant, it's basically a whole paper of a similar length to ours in the 2015 challenges. So my point there is maybe we just need to make better reference to that and maybe explain what the main challenges are for that particular area rather than reiterating exactly what was done. I think the UQ section is very different, and I don't think there's anything really more great deal mentioned of that in any of the challenges. There's a lot of new types of data that have become available since 2015, I think, in terms of network structures, and the citizen science data that we've talked about before is something that Hans highlighted as something being quite useful. So I think we might need to discuss that as well, about possibly putting something back into the paper relating to that kind of data. Hans gave specific examples of the types of apps where people can report symptoms and network structures as being particularly helpful. So I think that, well, my suggestion of moving forward is, as Kat says, that we need to start looking at possible overlaps with the previous papers, and where they're there, we need to justify why it is that we're including it again, or maybe discuss what advances have been made since 2015 in terms of those sections. Just going back to Hans's comments. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the points that you make have either been mentioned extensively in other sections, such as the data paper or the interventions paper. So I think we can just refer cross-reference to those where possible. And in my comments on the Hans's document, I've tried to refer to specific sections in other papers where this is mentioned. But I think there are certain aspects, like the phylogenetic data, that we need to discuss the specific challenges in more detail, possibly in section 4. I think was perhaps the most appropriate section for that. I know with the modelling paper, we've gone through a quite a fine-tooth comb looking at the overlap with the 2015 papers, but I think Hans was much stronger in his wording of overlap in that paper, whereas here it seems to be more just a reference to maybe we should mention the papers in passing in certain situations, but I don't know what everyone else's feeling is on that. Dennis, I know you were involved with the last series extensively. Do you see much of an overlap here, do you think?
Sorry. I think compared with the modelling paper, there's relatively little overlap, because I think particularly the structure judgment and the uncertainty quantification are not really topics that were addressed in 2015. I mean, they're new estimation approaches from the point of view, at least of modelers. They may have been going on for a long time, and epidemic modelers may have been unaware of them, which I'm sure is true to an extent, but certainly I think there was minimal reference, if any, in 2015, so I don't think they're a problem. So so I think it's more the other way around, that are there things, in bringing in some new estimation challenges, have we ignored older, perhaps more more standard ones, and which we should say something about? So
I mean, I looked through the titles of each of the individual challenges from those papers, and I didn't see anything obvious that we'd missed out that I think was included there, but I'd certainly be happy if anyone else thinks that we have, to hear any comments.
I mean, my understanding is the SEJ application to models is very new. And then Mark Bergman and I have been chatting about other things on the side. So he's been using it for getting SEJ, so in two different places, neither of which is really statistical, which I also wonder if we should discuss when we're talking about elicitation on the mechanistic or on the statistical side, because a lot of the paper is about quantification of the statistical parts. What he and I talked about was he uses expert judgment, or is starting to elicit parameters at, say, at the start of the pandemic when we didn't know the serial interval, or whether, you know, something like that's going on. Whereas we've been doing it more for the structure. So something like, is there or isn't there an asymptomatic stage, which is a fundamental difference in the structure of the model itself, not just the parameterization. And then also using the expert judgment to sort of draw down, partly because I'm doing this for multi-model stuff, right? All the stuff we're doing for the CDC, we're running this scenario hub. So we're on round 6 of repeated scenarios for the CDC with 10 models. And what we're using it for is to reduce linguistic and you know, uncertainty and cognitive biases in interpretations of interventions. So there's multiple different places the SEJ can be used, but it's really different. I've never seen anything of this before. So Mark's using it for model development in the first place. We're using it for intervention consistency. There's a bunch of different stuff going on, and none of it is particularly statistical. But I do think it's really novel. Like, it's only been in the last year or so. People have been sidling up to it, but there's nothing overt about it until the last year. So I'm sure that's not in the older papers, for example, but what I don't know is I haven't read all the other papers that are going into this special feature. So I have no idea if there's some of these ideas are trickling in there.
I guess in terms of model structure, we have talked about that in the modeling paper in terms of, so that's paper 6, that there's, you know, deciding on model structure. So Valerie, you about to say something?
I was only going to say there might be a bit in the interventions paper 4 as well, where they would discuss structure.
So I would say that links through to the uncertainty quantification, where we put in model discrepancy terms, which are specifically getting experts to say what the models don't do or cannot do.
I participated to the previous challenges papers, but at the time I really had probably never touched any data. So I mostly participated to the network models and the deterministic models and the multi-scale modeling very briefly, and the metapopulation/households models, but they were all kind of modeling papers. So I can see the natural tendency of things written 6 years after the previous special issue, not necessarily presenting lots of new mathematical models. So I can see how the modeling paper is more likely to kind of replicate some of the stuff in 2015. In terms of estimation, first of all, I don't know, because I wasn't participating to any estimation paper at the time, but also all the uncertainty quantification, I don't remember it being there. So it's natural that the overlap is much smaller. So I completely agree with what you're all saying.
So the only thing is things like combining data sources and weighting models that we talk about a little bit, but I still would argue that they're very much ongoing challenges, because it's very hard to come up with ways of combining data sources that are generalizable across all different types of data.
Model combination, at least for the effective reproduction numbers, they're done every week, and there has been lots of discussions about how to do it. There are multiple ways of doing it. It's never really that easy. So it's an open challenge completely.
So it might be we need to mention a reference to the previous papers for those sections and just say this is an ongoing challenge that people are still working on, because it's inherently difficult to generalize across all models.
There is the R paper. Carolyn's paper.
On that. And the Royal Statistical Society is organizing a meeting.
When that happens.
Yes.
Some meeting on the reproduction number?
Yes, I think it's a small, it says, they've asked them for some, it's a small meeting with a relatively small number of people, but that is just asked people to kind of write some papers and so on. I don't think it's like it's not a conference as it is. It's more like a.
Well, it's more, I think it's more like a, you know, the old red paper meetings or discussion meetings rather than red paper.
Yeah.
So a number of people asked to write sort of fairly short contributions and then quite a lot of discussion. But I did get it all a long time ago. And can you remind me, Lorenzo, my memory was that it was supposed to be happening around now, wasn't it?
Yeah. It's the meeting is going to be between the 9th and the 11th of June.
Uh-huh.
But yes, so there were basically these short contributions then will be discussed, and then I'm not really sure what the mode of publication of this thing is going to be, but there might be something else on the reproduction number coming out from that meeting. That's my point.
I mean, the discussion meetings used to get published in the journal, but whether
That hasn't been confirmed for this meeting yet. I inquired, but it hasn't been confirmed.
What, the publication or the meeting or?
The publication, the meeting is happening in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Publication is not clear.
No, I agree. But I mean, it might come out if we delay things by 2 weeks. We might have something to reference. But there is still our paper, the Caroline. That's definitely a preprint and so on. Yeah.
well, that one's been accepted now, so that's easy to refer to.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. No, definitely.
so that's okay.
But even if we were to kind of reference it now, it already exists as a preprint.
Sure.
Great, I'm happy to add that. So I think data from multiple sources is fairly straightforward, that we can say that that's just a very challenging problem to deal with on general rules. There's the phylogenetic and the network data and inference for those. I checked the estimation, the data paper, and there's discussions of the challenges of collecting the data and the privacy aspect of those in that paper, but there's probably remaining estimation challenges relating to estimating network structures and phylogenetic data that we perhaps need to extend in more detail. Chris?
Yeah, I was going to say in the interventions paper, there's a bit on that, not in terms of estimating network structure, more just how you can use those types of data to sort of look at intervention effectiveness. So looking at mobility data, looking at social contact data, and seeing how those change over time. So it's not explicitly saying we want to estimate the network structure, but really that's what people are doing when they're looking at their models, I guess. So we have to, if we do add anything, we'd have to be careful to make sure there's no overlap.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's not really an area of literature that I know much about. So if anyone has any expertise or knowledge of what's been done in the last 5 years on estimating network structures, that would be very welcome. Luke?
I don't have any knowledge on that, but a related point I'm not sure we are discussing in the paper yet is that the question or challenge, how do you weigh the information in different types of data sources? You cannot always let the model choose, because sometimes the data is more of a qualitative nature, or you cannot just throw likelihoods at it, or it's not reasonable to do so. Is that something we're discussing already?
Not that I'm aware of. We've talked about weighting models, but I don't think about weighting
data. Yeah, for
data.
Instance, in the neglected tropical diseases field where I work, we typically have data on programmatic data on program performance, so coverage of populations, and maybe some pre-control infection data, but you cannot calibrate your model to those two data sources at the same time, because as soon as the model structure doesn't capture a little detail for a particular situation, it's going to attribute it to the programmatic or the transmission aspect, and you make things bend over backwards, and it doesn't make sense anymore. And that problem only becomes worse with more data sources.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so I guess it's then just the question whether we want it, so whether it fits within the estimation paper, or whether it's more of a modeling data challenge. or an interventions data challenge, which is what I was saying about some of the other points, but not the points that you just raised, Luke.
Yeah, it's difficult because a lot of the other challenge papers have an estimation kind of section in them, so we'd need to be careful that it's not overlapping too much with that. But I think it's something that Hans has highlighted as something that might be lacking at the moment, so it's definitely worth considering in more detail. Another point he made was about the EQ section and whether we should be talking more about sensitivity analysis. Now, my point there is that that's kind of more related to model structure, and we do touch on that in the modeling paper. But Peter, do you have any?
I'd be happy to put a few lines in about sensitivity analysis,
okay.
some references in. I mean, yeah, it's not strictly speaking model calibration, but since this is probably the place in all the papers with the most description of uncertainty quantification, it's probably the best place for it. I'll have a chat with Ian, and we'll put a short paragraph together.
Would you, when you do the sensitivity, is it worth adding something about value of information type analyses as well?
So there is a whole paper on that in the 2015.
There is. Oh.
Danny wrote a paper on the value of information. So
who wrote that? Sorry.
Danny DeAngelis from Cambridge.
Good grief. Yeah, it's impossible.
So there is a lot of, again, you know, there's nothing wrong with mentioning it here. And I think it
anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe Peter.
So I think I would put something in about sensitivity analysis about the whole thing about reduced order modeling that can help the estimation, because you take away some parameters you don't have to estimate, to put it more in an estimation framework. And yeah, and again, that's if you're not getting value of information from on some parameter, there's no point estimating. So I try to cover that, but we'll do it in 3 or 4 lines.
Ben, the paper that Hans mentioned, the preprint, it's almost published in PLOS Computational Biology. So by the time we submit this, I can provide you with an updated reference.
Perfect. Yeah, I'll reference the preprint at the moment, but yeah, we'll need to go probably between now and the next round of revisions from submission. We'll need to go through and maybe change quite a few of the references. So what else did Hans say? So there's a mention of the different data being different denominations. So in different countries, you know, even within the UK, we've got various different types of measurements, you know, for mortality. Either it's those included on the death certificate, those died within 28 days of a positive COVID test. And that's just within the UK, presumably, you know, elsewhere, there's lots of other definitions as well. So he suggested that maybe we comment on that slightly and how we can deal with that statistically. The reality is that we're never going to be able to avoid that, but maybe if we can make suggestions or define a challenge associated with that. Okay.
We've had that problem in our analyses, because we'd say, you know, assume deaths, and then someone would say, well, what do you mean by death? Which apart from it evoked a bit of laughter, was actually really good, because it wasn't just like, is it incident deaths, is it cumulative deaths? Those are obvious ones, but is it reported or not, or is it indirect? You know, is it do we include the person who didn't go to the hospital but had a heart attack when they had a heart attack and died because they were scared of getting COVID or something like that? You know, and so within our one effort, we reduce that uncertainty via SEJ discussions. That's entirely why this stuff got subsumed into this estimation paper. How you do that across data streams, I still don't know, and other than acknowledge them and try to account for them in some way. I mean, but half of the battle is acknowledging that the differences exist. But yeah, it's coming up more and more now, because we've been in discussions with the WHO about how to use the methods we're using for the CDC, but in a broader scheme. And the problem is that, you know, if you're trying to do WHO level guidance, every country has different data collection schemes, and so the guidance that you think is a good broad guidance for many places actually won't work anyway. So it is a challenge, actually. I think it's worth a bit of space.
Yeah,
what everyone else thinks.
Chris and Lorenzo, I guess it ties in a little bit with your kind of noisy data, right censoring stuff in your section, do you think?
Yeah, I might be able to work into there. Can have a think.
It's perhaps a avenue that we hadn't really considered much, but
Yeah, I think
yeah, that's
I wrote it somewhere. I don't know if I did it in this one or the interventions paper, but it's
yeah,
one
that's
of those
I'm
things
sure
where
we've discussed it somewhere, but
yeah, because you have these issues like even looking at one of the big issues we have in sort of UK data is the hospital data, where the data you get given is submitted by hospital trusts, and they tell you people who are in hospital and they count them from the date they test positive rather than the date they're admitted to hospital. But if you look in any of the literature, it tells you how long people stay in hospital, conditioned on being admitted for COVID. So all those length of stay estimates are from day of admission, whereas all of your data is counting them from day of test, which is sort of on average maybe 2 days later by the time they get swabbed and then that test comes back. Which I acknowledge that's a problem in our model. We just pretend it doesn't exist as a problem because it's easier. But it's something that really we could do with better ways of dealing with.
yeah, it's just going to be an increasing challenge with all these new data sources and trying to combine them. One of the points I've made throughout is that we just need better metadata so we know what the observation process is, so we can then try and.
This is mentioned quite clearly also in the data.
Yeah.
In the data paper.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I completely agree.
It's worth mentioning here from an estimation point of view that we need that metadata to be able to build statistical models to account for any of those biases or
absolutely
underlying processes.
So the reality is that COVID in particular, but in general for infectious diseases, then we have a huge amount of data, but all that data is only indirectly telling you something. All the data is biased, basically. Like you never really have any truly unbiased data stream that it really informs you about the transmission process itself, which is what you're really interested in when you build a model. And so you have to combine different data streams to tell you something about it, and they might conflict with each other for reasons that you don't necessarily understand, in order to kind of build a picture of a process behind it that you can't observe. I'm sure that is like that I'm not saying anything new. I'm sure lots of people do uncertainty quantification stumble across this problem. But from a practical point of view, we are drowning in data and still can't really work out what's happening with COVID, really.
And another new type of data source is that Hans mentions is sewage data, and using that as a way of testing for COVID concentrations in sewage works and the statistical challenges that raises in terms of concentrations, for positive people and amount of shedding per individual that might vary across space and time.
There are actually quite some interesting analogies here with pooled survey results, which are being used in resource limited settings, where they don't want to test urine for everybody, but they just let everybody pee into a bucket and then you test.
Right.
And modeling that is actually quite straightforward. So I'm not really sure why Hans is flagging this as such a huge challenge.
They're doing it also with saliva tests here. For example, our university will test a batch of 5 pooled salivas, and then only go back and test the subgroups. Yeah, exactly. Only go back and test the individuals if there's a positive test within it, and it saves a lot of time. And so they batch stuff. Basically, I'd say batch it. It's much better than pooled saliva, but
they don't lick the same swab.
No, they spit into different little tubs, but then the tubs are merged.
So maybe he raised this issue because of the quality of the data, right? I don't think it's much of the modeling, but maybe the quality of the data that doesn't give you much information.
I think by the time it's all been mixed into a sewage system and you're collecting it much further downstream than where it's been introduced, I think you're then trying to work backwards and work out where it's.
I think rainfall is a bigger problem. The rainfall mixing.
Yeah.
The work here is in sewage systems only, so they have some more control over the flow and that they know the sort of trajectories, because they do actually, apparently, I think they do drug testing that way too. Where they're trying to sort of find drug dealers. There's some things I don't know the details, but anyway, there's some interesting issues.
So I suspect Hans was asking just to mention it rather than necessarily.
Well, yeah, I mean, the points with all, he said in his email that, we could ignore all of these. He's only just giving his point of view on it. So there's no obligation to include any of this, but it might also be mentioned. No, there's a couple of large groups in the UK working on this and big funding grants that have done. So presumably somebody thinks that it's enough of a problem or a challenge to warrant.
There was something presented at SPIAM recently about wastewater, because I know like Leon Danon and other people are working on it. So if needs be, if there is a need for a reference, I can probably ask.
I think some of Glenn's colleagues are working on it as well, so he might have some ideas on what's been going on.
Obviously, Luke's comment was quite sensible. So if we mention it, we can also draw the parallel with other things. And in terms of batch, they were also doing batch testing of like COVID tests, like PCR at the beginning, especially in resource limited settings. They were batching the test as well and try to use there are some papers on combinatorial approaches of this sort. So it's not only on saliva, but yes, that raises some challenges as well. Again, probably just worth mentioning.
Yeah. And then his final comment is about dashboards that each country have developed that often have multiple different measurements, which may have different levels of accuracy, I guess, and how we go about combining these into indicators that are actually independent, rather than having, obviously hospitalizations and cases and deaths are all going to be correlated with each other to some degree, and we don't actually have that many different independent pieces of information. He mentions the fact in the Netherlands they've used principal component analysis, which Jasmine and I have been working on a paper looking at something slightly more advanced than just a simple PCA, but there's, I'm sure, lots of alternatives that people can propose, or if it's presumably still the remaining challenge, that might be quite useful. Lorenzo, you just shared it. Is this? I know we've talked a lot previously about R0 as well as being the kind of often used as the standard, but there may be better alternatives to use to represent the state of the pandemic at a particular time point.
Of course, if you apply some sort of PCA or something that you reduce the amount of information can be useful, but sometimes you need to work with all of these types of data, right? Hospitalizations and everything, because they have some meaning, right? So this is, well,
it's one of the big disadvantages of PCA is it's often not the most interpretable, with it being quite unsupervised. But then again, often case data is particularly noisy and it's very much dependent and variable depending on who's being tested and what proportion are being tested and what test is being used. So having kind of a single value that you can report to policymakers might be more useful than that, which I think, I'm guessing that's what Hans' point is, but obviously there are potential ways of debating that, definitely. So I guess we need to start thinking about what the best way forward is for this, and how we go about divvying up the remaining challenges. Does anyone have a particular preference for any one of the? I know obviously things like the EQ and sensitivity. Peter's the obvious person for that.
I mean, I can have a go at the data section, but I don't know if I'll have time for the next week and a half, 2 weeks.
You haven't got everybody here, have you? So
Yeah.
you might be able to
Yeah, I know Glenn and
farm out a
TJ
bit, so-
sent apologies.
Excuse me.
I mean, it may be that's the action for this week, is that people put their names next to sections that they want to help out with. The other point to make is that Mark's made quite a few suggestions on the draft, which I've uploaded. Katrina made some as well, which were comments that I've addressed most of them, but there maybe are a couple of remaining ones that need addressing as well. Whereas Mark's done a lot of kind of.
Yeah, can I come in? Kat mentioned quite reasonably that in the light of the fact that we probably aren't going to have the projected companion paper on different SEJ methods, because I haven't found anybody to take charge of that, that some material ought to be added to this, just some light brush work on describing those. I don't feel sufficiently au fait with all those different things to do that. I wonder, Kat, or something you...
Well, so that was the point. Those separate, like the idea and the shelf, the people who put those in should describe them. Those were the people who suggested them, and they're the people from the SEJ group that seems to have been inadvertently dropped. So I don't know those methods either. I use modified Delphi methods, and I only started looking at SEJ methods about 3 or 4 years ago. And so I don't know any of these Sheffield ones. The idea one, I think Mark Bergman could probably do, because he works.
Yeah, maybe I better try and coordinate that then, and but just by, I mean, I won't write the stuff myself, but I'll try and get input from the people who know about these things.
My guess is just a few sentences.
We only want the sentence. We only want a couple of sentences.
Yeah, exactly. Mark could certainly do. I just don't know the shelf one at all. It was somebody who talked at the INI. I've forgotten his name.
Yeah, Kevin.
Was it Manchester or somewhere?
Kevin Wilson.
Yeah.
From Newcastle.
So people who wrote those sections could expand on them. And I just thought it's such a great opportunity for somebody who comes, like my background was never in SEJ methods. I only started reading about them because I needed them and saw that they would have benefits for what I was trying to do with multiple models. But I didn't wallow into the whole, you know, the morass of the details of all the different methods. And it just seemed such a waste not to explain their pros and cons.
Indeed, I was hoping that we would have a paper which would do exactly that, but it's looking increasingly doubtful that's going to be the case. So something can go in this one.
Well, certainly not in the time frame that you're interested in, Philip.
Oh, no.
We'll outline the full paper, because we thought we were having a separate SEJ paper. Maybe you guys don't know the background. So originally there was supposed to be a separate SEJ paper, and then it got subsumed into this one. And then somewhere along the lines, there's been this hiccup about keeping everyone in the loop. And then there was the possibility then to have the separate paper, but the person who outlined it is working very heavily for the WHO on COVID stuff right now. So he just doesn't have time. So he might do it eventually. He hasn't said no outright. He just hasn't said he can do it quickly. And I think it's a waste not to at least explain a bit more, because there's such useful methods that I just wasn't aware of at all.
Yes, I agree. Well, I'll try and round up the experts to just contribute little bits.
Is it worth trying to find? I mean, I know Phil sent round the email, but is it worth putting a bit more effort into trying to find somebody else to pick up and be prepared to lead with a separate paper, or do you think it's not feasible?
Well, I didn't have any volunteers.
Well, I know, but I would just wondered whether, you know, it was worth. It's not my area at all, but you know, if one can look a bit further afield, or.
So Valerie, I think what will happen is Will would write it. He outlined it. I mean,
Sure.
He did the work.
No, I understand that,
Completely hasn't got the bandwidth. Yeah.
I know that, and obviously, although there's not a complete sort of hard and fast timescale, I'm not sure how long that we can, you know, if we've got all the other papers into the volume, how long epidemics will be prepared to keep it open.
No, he was, that's his point. He absolutely can't do it on the time frame of this special feature. And he doesn't mean he might not do it later.
I don't think we were ever expecting that we would get this in sufficient time, it would get into the same volume. The
Oh,
idea, or
I
it
think,
could
oh,
come out
okay,
later.
there may have been a misunderstanding there too.
No, I think that time
I thought it was
never
going
to
to be
work.
delayed a bit, but I did think we were hoping to have it in the same volume. Dennis,
Well-
wasn't that your understanding
Yeah,
too?
yes, I thought so.
Yes,
And
okay. Not just me.
and I think
Anyway,
I'm trying to remember we had a discussion at some point that suggested that possibly in the case of sort of things that were extra papers rather than the mainstream, that the volume might be kept open to the end of this calendar year. Do you remember that, Valerie? Or was that, I can't remember if that was just a suggestion by one of us, or whether someone would
I
have more
don't
substance
remember
to it.
that. I know
But,
we,
but I think if there's the person power to actually produce something, but before the end of 2021, we could certainly inquire as to whether that can go into the same volume, because it would be nice to have it, but
and I,
Not from me or Will, I can assure you. Yeah, neither of us has the bandwidth to do it. That's why this, I think, got subsumed into the estimation paper, is because to write the whole extra paper was just not going to happen. I mean, he's flat out doing
I was hoping it was still going to happen. I was hoping that until recently, until I realized that nobody seems to want to take control of it. So that probably isn't going to happen.
I think there's two parts. There's, if you need it to happen within the next 8 months, no, there's nobody. If you don't mind when it happens, in other words, in time for the next outbreak that we all care about using these methods for, then there is the potential that Will do it, but it's not clear that he has the bandwidth even at that time frame.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for getting a paper on that out at some point, whenever it can be out. I think it will be a great paper, and it will be important to have it in the literature. Whether or not it ties into this particular volume may not be that important. But it does mean that there is a strong case for adding a little bit of extra material into the current paper.
And is no one else able to talk about that? Is it Will the only reference person worldwide who can talk about SCJ?
No, let me be clear. There were about multiple people working on this. Marissa Basket, Victoria Hemming, Mark Bergman, me, Will Probert, this guy that I've already forgotten his name, Kevin, somebody at Manchester. We were all working on it and had put in those comments. And so those are the people that we should go back to. They added it. It's just somehow they've been lost from the author list. And so they've been dropped somewhere along the line. It's not just me. I'm just repeating that.
Yeah, no, sorry.
That's why this has happened.
I arrived late and I missed that bit. And so, no.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So we lost people who wrote lots of text filtered via David, and somehow they've been misplaced. And that's why they're not continuing to contribute. But they did contribute in good faith, in my opinion, and they could augment it. But yeah, Kevin certainly seemed to be participating. Marissa Basket there were a lot of people who were writing text and adding comments to the SEJ section, which we had circulating around us repeatedly. So I think there's just been some sort of coordination oversight that has lost these people, and it should be relatively easy to suck them back in. But I think a lot of people were a bit taken aback not to have been included overtly. So I think they're just second guessing whether they want to participate, presumably.
I think Philip just offered to contact.
Excellent.
Try and round up the troops.
So my comment about Mark's work was just to check that everyone was happy. I've kept the old version and Mark's new version in the Dropbox, which has Kat's comments in as well that I've addressed and changed. Evidently, there's changes throughout, so I just want to make sure that everyone's happy with the changes that have been made to your section. I don't think there was anything drastic. It's mostly just small clarifications and slight wording changes, and Kat's were mostly references and
because I commented previously on the whole thing, but I had only really written in that one SCJ section. Mark did a bigger job this time, so it's easier to move my comments into his than vice versa. It looks like
that's exactly what I did, so they should all be in that one version, but it's just to check that everyone else is comfortable with what what's been changed. And there are a few remaining comments from Mark that I haven't had chance to change yet. So if they're on your section, please feel free to.
Ben, would you like us to accept the changes, or would you like us to highlight which things have to be reverted?
Yeah, if you can accept the changes on your section, that would be really helpful.
Yes.
So I know that you're happy with it. And then if there's any comments remaining after that, I mean, when you look at it, it seems like a lot of underlined text. So there does seem to be quite a lot of small edits, but quite a bit over the whole document. So that's why I'm flagging it up, just to make sure that everyone's happy. But if you can accept the changes on that version, that would be great. And also respond to any of his comments that relate to your section as well. So that's kind of the first action for next week. I can maybe go through the comments and start contacting people and seeing if they'd be happy to make certain extra contributions based on Hans's comments. Are people happy for me to do that, or would you rather volunteer?
If you have specific thoughts, that please flag them up.
Yeah.
Chris mentioned something we could do. I'm very happy to support him, but also in the next week, I'm still snowed under with the variant stuff. It's just taking all of our time.
Yeah.
There keeps being hotspots here and there, and we don't quite understand whether it's potentially kind of spreading around, whether targeted vaccination is relevant, whether it's just a bit of a mess.
So Kat, we meet this time every week. Usually we took a break while we were waiting for Hans to provide his comments because there wasn't much to do in the meantime. But the plan, I assume, going forward is to carry on meeting at this time on a Thursday, if it's convenient for everyone. And we use the same Zoom link every week for simplicity. And it's also recorded automatically onto Isaac Newton.
And can I just check, this is just until the paper finishes, is that
yes,
correct?
yeah, once we've submitted, then we'll stop, and until we get any revisions back from reviewers, then that would be the plan, I think.
Okay.
But also, if you can't attend meetings, that's fine. We can keep you in the loop about what's happened or any suggestions that need addressing.
I'm marking it down. There are a couple weeks, obviously I just found out about it, so there are a couple of weeks I can't make it, but some weeks I can. Yeah.
It is always recorded and uploaded, so if obviously it's then time to go back and watch it, but you know the opportunity there is there if you need it.
Thank you.
Okay, so it's nearly 6 o'clock. So sorry, so Luke, you're going to say something?
No, I was going to say thank you, Ben, for chairing.
That's all right, no problem. Yeah, is everyone happy if I kind of contact you this week with possible? I mean, some of it I can do myself, but there's obviously people who are more of an expert in certain areas than I am, and knowledgeable in the literature, so I wouldn't want to say anything that's.
Yeah, feel free to contact us at least.
Yeah, I mean, with the caveat that you're very welcome to turn around and say, no, I haven't got time.
No. I mean,
no.
Yeah, no. I mean, but I expect everyone is in the same situation. It's just, I realize it's always very difficult to edit someone else's text if you're not really sure what.
Yeah, that's why I didn't want to make any changes based on Mark's comments, because I know that a lot of people have worked on other sections that.
Yeah, exactly. I often think, I could rephrase this, but I'm not really sure whether the idea is sticking to the original of the person.
Yeah. Well, I'd suggest always, if you feel like way, please just put it as a comment next to it, and then whoever's written that section can incorporate it or not as they see fit.
Thank you, Ben.
No problem. If there's nothing else, have a good weekend, everyone, and see you next Thursday.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
No problem.
Thanks, Ben.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye.